I think it is clear to believe in the power of ideas.
Fresh thinking to the Manhattan Institute.
I'm Jim Copland. I'm the director of the Center for Legal Policy at the Manhattan Institute. It's my pleasure to welcome you here to our Proxy Monitor 2012 event, concurrent with the release of our new report on corporate governance and shareholder activism. I'd like to welcome everyone here in the room for coming, as well as those following us on live stream on the internet. Those of us in the room, if you could please turn off cell phones, beepers, and other things that might interrupt our panelists later as we're discussing these corporate governance issues. For those of us who are new here, I just sort of wanted to frame briefly what the Manhattan Institute Center for Legal Policy is and why we're doing this Proxy Monitor effort. The Manhattan Institute Center for Legal Policy was formed in the mid-1980s. And at various points, we've focused a lot historically on reforming U.S. civil litigation, as well as over-criminalization or criminal law issues or criminal law as it relates to the business community. There was always sort of an intersection with that and the areas of corporate governance and securities law. Of course, securities class action litigation is a large component of litigation overall. And we saw here in New York our Attorney General Eliot Spitzer doing a lot of criminal activity prosecutions, or at least threatened prosecutions that affected a lot of businesses, often through corporate governance-related complaints. But in the second half of the last decade, we started hearing increasingly from the business community about increased activity on the part of a certain subset of shareholder activists that were really trying to reshape businesses through the shareholder proposal process. For many years, there have been activist investors who filed shareholder proposals. Some of those we'll discuss today, groups of nuns, people like Evelyn Davis. But we really saw sort of a paradigm shift going on in the back half of the last decade. And concurrent with that, subsequent to the Sarbanes-Oxley reforms after the dot-com bubble burst and Enron and what have you, we saw, to some degree, an exit of U.S. capital in the IPO markets that concerned us. So several years ago, we had the Future of Wall Street event here with various people in New York talking about what does Sarbanes-Oxley mean, what do these increased business prosecutions mean, and securities litigation mean for the future of our main industry here in New York City. And then a couple of years ago, after much consideration and discussion with people on both sides of this issue, we decided to launch Proxy Monitor in January of 2011. And our principle here was really to analyze this question empirically. In other words, there were very intelligent schools of thought on both sides of this question. You had Harvard's Lucian Bebchuk on the academic side saying shareholders don't have enough power. And the shareholder proposal process is an important way, shareholder voting rights are an important way to improve shareholders' power over management run amok. On the other side, you had my friend Stephen Bainbridge down in UCLA and others saying, wait a minute, the traditional director-centered form of corporate governance makes a lot of sense. Shareholders in public companies have the ability to exit by selling their shares. Voting power may matter in things like takeover situations and what have you, but there's lots of reasons we don't want shareholders voting on all the sorts of business that goes through American corporations. We didn't see a lot of empirical evidence to answer this question or to shed light on this debate, so we decided to do it. And as we were doing it, we discovered that getting the data itself was costly and or onerous. So we started to say, well, we're just going to pull a lot of this data ourselves, and we're going to make it public so other people can try to replicate our work or do their own original analysis. We started with the Fortune 100 and increased to the Fortune 150 and then the Fortune 200, which is the basis for this report today, pulling all their shareholder proposals, now going back all the way to 2006. And for the last 2 years, the management proposals related to executive compensation advisory votes, which were mandated by the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act of 2010. And so that's where we are today with this project, and here's the results effectively in year 2 of our research. At the outset, before I get into those, I want to say some thank yous. First of all, the entire Manhattan Institute team who've made this possible, from President Larry Moan, Executive Vice President Vanessa Mendoza, and our Vice Presidents Lindsay Young, Craig Howard Husick, and Michael Barrero. We've also, I really want to focus on our editorial team led by Matthew Hennessy, who do a great job of getting lots of reports through, including this one, which has lots of graphics, as you'll see in the report, which are a little outside their normal scope. And I particularly want to thank my Manhattan Institute project manager, Isaac Gorodetsky, and especially the 2 people who are listed as co-authors here because their contributions were so significant. Yevgeny Feynman, who really helped execute our econometric portion of this analysis at the end of the report, and Margaret O'Keefe, who's the project manager for Proxy Monitor. Every piece of data that's in this website has gone through her hands, and she's overseen it, and she's given me enormous insights here. She's a longtime specialist in this area of law. So with that, I will try to move forward here. Here we go. So here's basically what our Proxy Monitor 2012 report covers. It draws on our database. Again, it includes the Fortune 200 companies, so the largest 200 U.S. companies by revenues, dating back to the beginning of 2006. And we really ask 4 questions in this year's report. Who's driving this shareholder activism? What's the subject of shareholder activism? Where is shareholder activism focused, and how have shareholder proposals fared? Now, at the outset, I want to stress that there's many types of shareholder activism, and we're really focused on this shareholder proposal process vis-a-vis shareholder voting. We're not talking about what's another common type of shareholder activism, and one that I would think largely has a salutary effect in terms of driving share prices upward, and that's when activist investors buy large stakes in companies and try to shake up boards and managements by investing large amounts of their own money and making changes. Carl Icahn, sort of a paradigmatic example here. Bain Capital, founded by Mitt Romney, has been a lot in the news cycle this year. I think by and large this type of activist investing on average increases shareholder value. It's different than this sort of shareholder proposal voting we're talking about here, which is really a function of SEC rules that say if you own $2,000 worth of stock and you've held it for at least a year, you can introduce a shareholder proposal at a company that you hold stock in. Now, what we see here actually in terms of the number of these proposals is that there's been a decrease over time at the Fortune 200 companies, particularly in the last 2 years. Now, the main reason for this, as we'll see in a few minutes, is that after 2010, we don't have any more of one of the most popular classes of proposal anymore, i.e. the say-on-pay proposals, or the proposals seeking an advisory vote on executive compensation, because that is now required of management under the Dodd-Frank reform bill. And so every company now has to put its say-on-pay proposal on the ballot, and you don't see any more proposals asking for a say-on-pay vote. And that's a significant reason for the drop after 2010 in the introduction of the number of proposals. Now, who's been driving this shareholder activism? And the results here are basically like the ones we found last year, and in the report we include the entire data set going back to 2006. But there's really, the real takeaway here is that large institutional investors that are unaffiliated with labor union pension funds and not oriented around an express social or public policy or religious purpose for their investing constitute only 1%. They've sponsored only 1% of all shareholder proposals over the last 7 years, and again, that's the case in 2012. So what you really have are three distinct types of proposal sponsor that are active proponents. One are individuals, and there are a plurality of all proposals, although, as you'll see in 2012, for instance, the vast majority of those, 31% of the total, are what are so-called corporate gadflies and their families. And in fact, this is an under-inclusive representation of the corporate gadflies because we're only counting the three most prominent corporate gadflies. There are other ones that I think fit that bill that are in that orange other individuals piece of the pie. Secondly, we have the labor-affiliated investors. These are primarily labor union pension funds, both public and private. And then third, we have social investing funds, religious-affiliated investors like groups of nuns or church pension funds, and public policy investors, such as the People for Ethical Treatment of Animals, for instance, which is regularly introducing animal rights proposals at some of the companies like Tyson Foods. When you look for this year, and this trend basically maps that we've seen across the full 7 years, you see this in real time. So these three gadfly investors, John and Ray Chevedden, Ken and William Steiner, and Evelyn Davis, have been the most frequent proponents of shareholder proposals in 2012, followed by labor union pension funds, the American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees, the New York City and State Retirement Funds, and the AFL-CIO pension funds. So these, just a little bit of light on these sort of gadflies to shed light on what they're doing. Evelyn Davis is a character. She's 82 years old, and she's, by her own marks, sort of scaled down her efforts this year. She's only the number 3 proponent. Often she's a little bit higher, number 1 or number 2. She once showed up to a shareholder meeting in a bikini. On another instance, she actually nominated a director to a board who was a softcore porn star. And she's an independently wealthy woman. Her money comes largely from inheritance and 4 divorces. But she does make about an estimated $600,000 annually by selling a 20-page newsletter for $495, which, of course, all the big corporations decide they want to buy. And in fact, the corporations are so solicitous of Ms. Davis that in the 1990s, Lee Iacocca offered to deliver personally any car that she purchased from Chrysler. Ms. Davis introduces a lot of proposals. She doesn't have a lot of success. Only 1 out of her 148 proposals that she's introduced at the Fortune 200 since 2006 has gotten majority support from shareholders. Now, John Chevedden and his allies are of a different sort. They aren't flamboyant at the meetings. They do a lot of their proposals in writing. Chevedden himself is 66 years old, was an early exponent of say on pay, and he's now been pushing for a lot of proposals seeking shareholder action outside the meetings by ability to call special meetings with a certain percentage of shareholders or to act by written consent outside annual meeting process. Now, the other folks, Ken and William Steiner's the father, Ken's the son. They've apparently never met Chevedden in person, but when you look at their proposals, as well as members of the Rossi family, which are Emil is the father, and then Chris and Nick are the sons, they introduce common classes of proposals, the same sorts of types of proposals year after year. And it's important to understand that the SEC only permits a shareholder to introduce 1 proposal at a company per year. So there's at least some talk here that these folks are coordinating their efforts. Well, you hit them with this proposal, and I'll hit them with a parallel proposal. And often, in fact, these people will grant representation at the meeting to the other person. So there's some teamwork there going on. Now, unlike Ms. Davis, Chevedden, Steiner, Rossi family proposals have met with a significant level of success. In our database since 2006, 102 of the 350 proposals these allied shareholders have sponsored have gotten majority shareholder support. And unlike Ms. Davis, who's often solicited by and treated with a lot of kid gloves by management, that hasn't been the case for Chevedden and his friends. KBR and Apache actually sued Chevedden to keep one of his proposals off their ballot, and Limited Brands actually sued him for introducing materially misleading facts on his proxy submission on their ballot. So it's a much more hostile relationship with management. Now, when it comes to labor unions, we've seen actually a shift this year in the composition of proposals. Traditionally, a majority of the labor union-backed proposals, dating back to 2006 at the Fortune 200, were sponsored by private sector labor unions. This year, a majority were sponsored by the American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees and state or city-specific employee pension funds. So we see the public sector employees unions taking a bigger role this year. Part of that, I think, is due to the increased introduction of these political spending or lobbying related proposals that we'll get to in a little bit. But the percentage of, similarly, we've seen a shift in the sort of socially oriented investor composition of proposals this year. 61% this year of these proposals were sponsored by social investing funds. That's a departure from the historic norms looking back to 2006, where a plurality of these types of proposals were introduced by religious affiliated investors. And what we've seen particularly this year is a precipitous drop-off. It's really a two-year trend, but a precipitous drop-off this year in Catholic-oriented funds, shareholder investors, specifically these activist nuns. Now, of course, these nuns have come under fire from the Vatican. That may explain or may not explain the drop-off, but we've seen a significant drop-off and a significant increase in the social investing funds activity. Again, I think the social investing funds activity here is also in part a function of the push toward more political spending-related proposals on the ballot. Now, so what's the subject of shareholder activism? This is our look at it. We basically categorized shareholder proposals in three main buckets. So corporate governance is really the rules of the game, the process-based rules. How do we elect directors? Who serves as the chairman of the company? When can shareholders act outside shareholder meetings and what have you? The other two are really substantive changes, trying to affect the way business practice is conducted, relating either to executive compensation, and that's the say-on-pay proposals prior to 2011, as well as other executive compensation proposals related to equity plans or golden parachutes or what have you, and then these sort of social or policy-related proposals having to do with the environment or human rights or employment discrimination or political spending. Now, this right here, this graph, as you'll notice, is 2006 to 2010. And we see that there's executive compensation, there's a bit fewer of those, but that they're pretty much about a third apiece. Over the last 2 years, that's shifted as the executive compensation related proposals have been far fewer. Social policy this year and last year have been actually a little more relative to corporate governance over the years. Of course, the reason the executive compensation numbers are down is because the say-on-pay votes are now being introduced by management under Dodd-Frank, and so you see a lot less activity there, and in fact, probably activists interested in that issue are focusing more on the say-on-pay votes rather than structuring proposals in other areas of executive compensation. The say-on-pay story is an interesting one because this really was non-existent in U.S. corporate governance prior to 2006. It was brought in from the United Kingdom, and you saw 4 proposals introduced at the Fortune 200 in 2007, and then a steady increase year over year in the number of these proposals being introduced. You saw some drop-off in 2010. That could be in part because companies had adopted say-on-pay processes after getting these shareholder proposals. It was also doubtless in part because activists pushing this were aware that this was in the mix for Dodd-Frank and therefore not going to be something they needed to focus on that year. Now, for the social policy related shareholder proposals in 2012, as I'd alluded to, we've seen a significant uptick in the percentage of proposals related to political spending or lobbying. The majority of these relate to disclosure of various types of political spending or lobbying. And this is, again, a departure from historic trends. Going back to 2006, a plurality of proposals related to social or policy issues concern the environment. But what we've seen is an uptick, particularly spurred on by the Citizens United decision in January of 2010 by the Supreme Court in these proposals related to corporate political spending or lobbying. So we've seen since 2010 basically a doubling of the number of these proposals and a tripling since 2008 up to over 1/4 of a proposal per company, or 1 in 4 companies, more than that, actually are facing one of these proposals this year. Now, in terms of corporate governance-related proposals, we've seen, again, a sort of a trend that's a departure from historic norms. Normally, the voting rules proposals predominate here. Now, to some degree, there's been a shrinkage in the number of these because a lot of companies have already adopted majority voting of directors, which is a principal type of voting rules proposal. But we've also seen an uptick in these chairman independence proposals this year. This was pre-announced by the labor unions as a priority, and this is basically saying we want to have a separate chairman and CEO. Skeptics may say, well, one reason labor unions are interested in this is obviously the chairman CEO, who's a joint chairman CEO, doesn't want to give up control of the company before he's ready, or doesn't want to have a chairman overseeing him if he's actively running the company, and that may be part of their interest. The empirical evidence on this is quite mixed, the impact of chairman independence. But what we have seen, again, is that 2012 is a historic year in terms of the number of these proposals introduced per company, and a significant uptick from just last year. So now, where is the shareholder activism focused? This is really tracking where the labor unions do it. And what we see is that there's a significant variance, and there's a graph in the report looking at the variance sector to sector in the number of proposals you typically expect for a company. Now some of this is explained by reasons that are pretty self-evident. Depends how many large companies you have. 9 out of the top 10 largest companies by market capitalization received multiple shareholder proposals in our database, 3 or more shareholder proposals in our database, out of a total of, I think, 18 that totally received them. The exact numbers are all in the report. The exception out of those 10, by the way, is Berkshire Hathaway, and there's an obvious reason why that doesn't get a lot of shareholder proposals, because Warren Buffett can vote them all down, and so they're not going to be highly sensitive to this type of shareholder activism. But another key explanatory factor, apart from company size and sector, is the differing behavior of labor unions and labor union pension funds across companies and across sectors. And what you'll see for the last 7 years is that labor unions have been much more likely to introduce proposals in retail, telecommunications, and financial services companies than in other sectors. Now, interestingly, these are sectors that labor has targeted in union organizing campaigns, and in fact, there are 6 companies in the Fortune 200 that have gotten multiple proposals from labor unions that are also being targeted by labor union organizing campaigns: Bank of America, Citigroup, Rite Aid, Safeway, Walmart, and Wells Fargo. There are only 4 companies this year that got, and we'll switch to this year here. Again, you see the same trends. You do see an uptick in energy this year, and those reasons we'll get into as we see there's only 4 companies that have gotten more than 2 labor-backed proposals this year, and I think they're illustrative. 2 of those are energy companies, ExxonMobil and Anadarko Petroleum. ExxonMobil got 3 proposals, Anadarko got 4. Now, Exxon's, given its size, is somewhat understandable, but it's also worth pointing out that Exxon gave 88% of its PAC contributions to the Republican Party or Republican candidates. This is atypical for large companies, and it may have raised a flag for labor unions and encouraged them to go after the company more aggressively. Anadarko likewise gave 79% of its contributions to the GOP. It's also heavily investing in natural gas fracking, which is both politically sensitive and to some degree a threat to labor union interests, given unionized coal workers that would to some degree be displaced by this new technology. What it's hard to say is that these energy companies were targeted by the labor unions because they had lower than average share returns. When you look at Exxon in 2011, its share return was 15.9%. By comparison, Chevron's was 16.6%, slightly higher. Royal Dutch Shell, 7%, much lower. ConocoPhillips, Royal Dutch Shell, 9.5%. ConocoPhillips, 7%. And BP, understandably, minus 3.2%. Anadarko Petroleum, the same story. It only got a 0.2% share price return in 2011. But look at its sort of competitor basket of companies. Chesapeake Energy got minus 14%, Halliburton minus 15.5%, Schlumberger minus 18.2%. So it's hard to argue that these energy companies are being targeted because they're underperforming their peers. The other two companies are basically the same story. The company that got the most labor-backed proposals in 2012 was Abbott Labs with 6. 4 of those proposals involved executive compensation. One of them involved chairman independence. So again, these are highly sensitive things for management. And what's going on here? Well, Abbott Labs has been one of several pharma companies targeted by labor unions for not giving overtime pay to its pharmaceutical sales reps. But I think probably more significantly here, its CEO, Miles White, has been an open proponent of public sector labor reforms in Wisconsin, with Scott Walker, in Illinois, and in other places. But again, it's hard to argue that Abbott Labs is being targeted based on its share price performance when its stock price in 2011 rose 17.4% as opposed to 23.6% for Pfizer, significantly better, but other competitors lower, 16.3% at GlaxoSmithKline, 4.6% at Merck, minus 3% at Novartis. So again, it's hard to say, well, this is an underperforming company, and that's why it's drawing a lot of these proposals. The same thing for the fourth company to get more than 2, and that's Dean Foods, which got 3 labor proposals. It's been targeted by the California Farmers Union for exerting market pressure on dairy farmers, and its share price rose 26.7% versus 19.9% for Tyson Foods, 18.8% for Kraft, 17.7% for Smithfield, 13.8% for General Mills, and minus 1% for Kellogg. Again, the highest performing share price for this company in the year before these proposals were introduced. Now, how the shareholder proposals fared, our final question. In terms of votes, they get about the same vote every year. So there's almost an equilibrium here, around 26% in terms of the votes. So the proponents are introducing various proposals that tend to wind up around the same place. When it comes to which ones are getting majority support, there's substantial variation and a drop-off this year. We don't think this drop-off is due to explainable trend factors, and I'll get into that as to why when I look at our econometric analysis, but it's really a function of what sorts of proposals are being introduced, because there's a significant variance across classes of proposals in terms of the support they get. So voting rules proposals get the most support, and this is a bifurcated result. Majority voting proposals are much more likely to get strong support. Cumulative voting proposals, which allow shareholders to aggregate their votes behind, say, one single director, typically don't get nearly as much support. But these other sort of corporate governance-related proposals, so special meetings and written consent, other corporate governance proposals, including the most supported class of proposal, those for declassifying boards and having annual director elections, get much more support. At the other end of this spectrum, these social policy proposals get very limited support, only 17% this year for the environment, 17% for political spending, and 11% for all the other social-related types of proposals. And so, to some degree, that majority voting trend that we saw, when we're getting majority support, is a function of the types of proposals being introduced. Majority voting, one of the reasons we had a lot of support in 2006 for proposals generally were that there were a lot of majority voting proposals that passed. And as more and more companies adopted majority voting, we've seen a decrease in the number of those proposals, and other classes of proposals have started to be launched, including these special meetings for shareholder action, written consent for shareholder action types of proposals. We saw an uptick this year in declassify the board proposals. These almost always do pass a majority vote when they're introduced. And when it comes to political spending, which has gotten a lot of the public attention here, we actually saw a decrease this year down to 17% support. The only proposal across the entire database that has gotten majority shareholder support was a 2006 political spending disclosure proposal at Amgen, which got 67% of the vote. But notably, that was after the board of directors recommended that shareholders support the proposal. And even after that, it got 1/3 opposition. A major reason why you saw the drop-off this year is you've seen an increase in the number of proposals that are, I would argue, the more extreme class of proposals. We want a shareholder advisory vote on political spending decisions, or we want to prohibit political spending by the corporation. The vote numbers there haven't shifted a lot, but there's a lot more of those proposals this year. But the basic political spending related proposals, we've also seen a year-over-year decrease, particularly those by the Center for Political Accountability, which has sponsored a sort of basic political spending disclosure proposal. They've dropped from about 26% to 22-23% this year. And that's largely why that is a little hard to explain for sure. It could be that the companies are fighting back more and making their case better. It could be, as the director of the Center for Political Accountability asserts, be because certain companies have made shifts in their behaviors in terms of what they've disclosed, and that explains the result. I'll turn to our econometric analysis now. I can talk more about political spending and Q&A, but I want to get on to this so that we can get to our panel. And basically what we did was set up an econometric regression equation looking at all the shareholder votes to try to explain shareholder vote behavior from 2006 to 2012, looking at various factors: company size, industry, the proponent, the proposal type, the year it was introduced, and whether or not ISS, which is the largest proxy advisory firm with a 61% market share, recommended for or against the proposal. And these results, there's a heck of a lot of numbers up there, but let me just sort of distill them for you. We've taken the industry out of here because none of that was significant, and we wanted to have a cleaner result. In other words, we didn't see the industry affecting the vote results as we looked at it. Many of these variables like year, proposal type, and proponent, there's an omitted variable. There's technical reasons why we do that. But the basic takeaway is for proponent, there's not a lot of impact based on who proposes it. The labor-sponsored proposals, on average, get about 4 percentage points more vote at a statistically significant level than individual-backed proposals. That's probably merely a function of them focusing more on the types of proposals they're introducing, how they craft them, and what have you. Proposal type, on the other hand, makes a very big difference. And declassify the board, as I'd alluded to, is 27 percentage points more vote in the vote total than voting rules proposals, which we have as sort of the baseline here. Conversely, political spending is 12 percentage points below voting rules proposals, and other social policy is almost 16 percentage points below voting rules proposals. Again, I mean, this is controlling for all the other factors in the model, so this is pretty significant. The type of proposal makes a difference. Again, not shocking. Shareholders value these things differently. The year makes essentially no difference, with the exception of 2011, where we did see a slight uptick, about 4.5% uptick in support comparing to other years in the model. Part of that may be due to the types of proposals being introduced at a more specific area than we're able to accommodate for here. Also, it may simply be a function of the fact that management was really worried about the say-on-pay executive compensation advisory votes in the first year of their introduction, and they focused a lot more effort on that and less effort proportionately on the shareholder proposals being introduced. But by far the biggest impact here is ISS, the proxy advisory firm. And controlling for other factors, if ISS recommends in favor of a shareholder proposal, it gets 15 percentage points more of the vote. Again, realizing that 25% is the average vote here, that's a 60% uptick in the vote if ISS is for it. And the other interesting thing about ISS when we started looking at it is that ISS systematically is supporting these shareholder proposals much more than shareholders are themselves. So when you crunch these numbers, 99% of virtually all the time they're backing a lot of these classes of proposals. Shareholders much less likely to be doing so, and they're proposals that shareholders are never backing, like environment, human rights, employee rights, that ISS is backing with some consistency, 35, 45%. Political spending, where they've adopted a generally for position, they've backed 70% of those proposals. Only 1%, only one of those proposals I mentioned, Amgen's, has passed over the full data set. And so it's a significant disconnect between what ISS is doing, supporting in the aggregate 63% of all shareholder proposals, and what shareholders themselves are doing, backing only 8% of shareholder proposals. So it's a little bit like the media. The media may have a systemic left-wing bias. It also has an influence. ISS has a systemic pro-shareholder proposal bias, and there are various reasons for that. I can get into them to some degree when we sit down on our panel that I explore in the report, but they also have a significant influence, 15 percentage points, 60% influence on the votes. And just briefly, say on pay, which we put as an appendix in the report, it's outside the shareholder proposal scope. But the average shareholder vote at these companies, virtually the same, 87.8%, 87.5%. Majority of shareholders only opposed pay packages at 3 companies, Best Buy, Citigroup, Community Health Systems. Conversely, while there's a 1.5% of the total database that shareholders opposed pay packages, ISS opposed pay packages at 13% of the companies. So again, they're seeing a anti-management, systemic bias on the part of ISS relative to what shareholders are actually doing. But we do see significance, 17.5 percentage point reduction in shareholder support for executive pay if ISS is against it. Given that the average is about 87.5%, that's a 20% drop in shareholder support. So less important probably in percentage terms than the shareholder proposals. But again, this is a highly sensitive area, and management's going to fight pretty hard on this. Whereas a lot of these shareholder proposals are sort of, they're getting limited support in many cases. So that's basically my report here, and you can look at it in more detail. Each of you's got it in front of you. At this point, it's my pleasure to welcome up our moderator for an exciting panel we've got to react to this report and talk about these issues, and that's T.K. Kerstetter. His bio is in more detail in your package, but he's the president of Corporate Board Member, which is a New York Stock Exchange Euronext company. It's focused on corporate board thought leadership. He's got a long-standing experience in this field with previously serving as the president and director of the $2 billion publicly held Wilmington Savings Fund Society over a 20-year banking career. And he is the co-host of the This Week in the Boardroom weekly on-demand web broadcast show filmed at the New York Stock Exchange. I've had the pleasure of being on this show a couple times, and I'm going to be again next week talking about these issues. So TK, if you could come forward, and as well as our other panelists, come up to the front, and we'll talk about this some more. Thanks so much.
I think it is clear how fortunate we are to believe in the power of ideas.
Supply the common sense and the fresh thinking of the Manhattan Institute.